In the small village of Halomir, where the forest met the edge of the kingdom, life moved slowly and quietly. The villagers rose with the sun, worked the fields, and slept when the stars came out. Among them lived a widow named Ayra, a woman known for her gentle hands and her patient heart. She lived alone in a small stone cottage at the far end of the village, near the tree line where the royal forest began. Her husband had died many years before, leaving her with little more than a garden, a spinning wheel, and the quiet company of her own thoughts. Ayra earned her living by mending clothes for the villagers. She was skilled with a needle, and though her hands had grown slower with age, her stitches were still neat and strong. She was respected, though not wealthy, and she asked for little from the world. Her days followed a simple rhythm: wake, tend the garden, mend clothes, walk to the market, and return home before dusk. One cold morning in early autumn, everything changed. The night before had brought a heavy storm, with rain that pounded the rooftops and wind that bent the trees nearly to the ground. When Ayra stepped outside the next morning to check her garden, she heard a faint, trembling sound coming from beneath her porch steps. She knelt down, moved aside a broken plank, and found a small, shivering puppy curled into a tight ball, soaked through and shaking with cold. He was not like the other dogs in the village. His fur was a deep, stormy gray, almost silver in the morning light, and on his chest was a strange marking shaped like a crescent moon. He had no collar, no sign of where he had come from, and he was far too weak to even lift his head. Ayra did not hesitate. She wrapped him in her shawl, carried him inside, and set him near the fire. She warmed some milk and fed him slowly, drop by drop, until his shivering stopped and his breathing steadied. She stayed awake with him through the night, watching over him as though he were her own child. By morning, the puppy had opened his eyes. They were a pale amber color, sharp and alert, studying her face with an intelligence that seemed almost unusual for such a small creature. Ayra smiled and gently touched his head. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" she said softly. "Let's call you Bramble, after the thicket where I found you." She had no way of knowing where Bramble had truly come from, or what significance he carried, though the truth was far grander than she could have imagined. Weeks before, a royal hunting party had passed through the forest near Halomir. Among them was the king's most treasured hound, a loyal and noble animal who had been the king's closest companion since his childhood. Years earlier, the king himself had rescued an injured wild dog deep in the forest, nursing her back to health with his own hands before releasing her back into the wild. Unknown to the court, that wild dog and the king's hound had crossed paths again, and from that meeting came a litter of pups, born far from the castle, hidden among the trees. During the storm that swept through the region, the litter had been separated. Most of the pups did not survive the harsh weather, but one had been carried by the rushing floodwaters, tumbling and drifting until he found shelter beneath the porch of a stranger's cottage. That pup was Bramble. The king never knew exactly what became of that litter. He only knew that his hound had returned from the forest thin and restless, pacing at the edge of the trees for days afterward, as though searching for something she could not find. The king, burdened by the duties of his kingdom, could not spare the time to investigate. Life at the castle moved quickly, filled with meetings, treaties, and the endless demands of ruling a kingdom. Slowly, the matter faded into the background of his busy life, though it never fully left his mind. Meanwhile, in Halomir, Bramble grew. He grew quickly and strongly, his gray coat thickening into a handsome, shining coat that caught the eye of every villager who passed by. He was larger than the other village dogs, with a calm, watchful presence that seemed almost regal. He followed Ayra everywhere, walking beside her to the market, sitting patiently outside the tailor's shop while she worked, and guarding her garden from foxes and rabbits with quiet determination. The villagers often remarked on how intelligent Bramble seemed. He understood simple commands almost instantly, seemed to sense danger before it arrived, and had a gentle, protective nature that put children and elders alike at ease. Some joked that he must have royal blood in him, given his noble bearing, though no one truly believed it. Ayra would only smile at such comments, and say, "He's simply a good dog who found a good home." As the years passed, Ayra and Bramble became inseparable. He slept by the fire at night, walked beside her during the day, and seemed to know her moods better than any human companion could. When she was sad, he rested his head on her lap. When she was tired, he stayed close, watching over her as she worked. When she was happy, his tail would wag with an energy that made her laugh out loud. Ayra never remarried, and she never had children of her own. Bramble became her family, filling the quiet corners of her life with warmth and companionship. The villagers often said that watching the two of them together was like watching an old friendship that had lasted far longer than a single lifetime. What Ayra never knew was that, twice during those years, a lone rider passed through Halomere at dusk. The rider wore a plain dark cloak that gave no hint of his identity, and he asked no questions of the villagers. He would guide his horse quietly to the edge of the forest, near Ayra's cottage, and wait there in the shadows of the trees, watching. The first time, he saw Bramble as a young dog, chasing after a butterfly in Ayra's garden, while she hung laundry on a line nearby. The rider watched for a long while, his expression unreadable, before turning his horse and disappearing back into the forest without a word. The second time, years later, he saw Bramble as a fully grown dog, resting peacefully in a patch of afternoon sunlight, while Ayra sat nearby, mending a shirt. The rider watched the pair for a long moment, something heavy and unspoken in his eyes, before once again turning away and riding back toward the castle. That rider was the king. He never approached, he never revealed himself. He carried the weight of his kingdom on his shoulders, and though his heart ached with a quiet longing to know the pup his own hound had brought into the world, duty always pulled him away before he could take a single step closer. He told himself there would be time later, that he would return again when his responsibilities allowed it, that he would knock on the cottage door and finally learn the truth. But time, as it often does, slipped quietly away. Years turned into more years. Ayra's hair grew silver, her steps grew slower, and her hands grew stiffer with each passing winter. Bramble, too, began to show signs of age. His muzzle turned gray, his energetic bounds became gentle walks, and he spent more of his days resting by the fire than chasing butterflies in the garden. But his loyalty never wavered. Even in his old age, he would rise slowly, to walk beside Ayra whenever she left the cottage, refusing to let her go anywhere alone. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside the cottage windows, Bramble lay curled by the fire, his breathing slow and steady. Ayra sat beside him, running her fingers gently through his graying fur, remembering the stormy night so many years ago when she had found him shivering beneath her porch. "You've given me more joy than I ever thought I'd have again," she whispered to him. "Thank you, my old friend." Bramble lifted his head weakly and looked at her with those same pale amber eyes, still sharp despite his age, and rested his head against her hand. That night, as the snow continued to fall outside, Bramble passed away peacefully in his sleep, curled beside the fire in the home that had loved him for so many years. Ayra mourned deeply. The cottage, once filled with the sound of Bramble's steady footsteps and contented sighs, felt unbearably quiet. She buried him beneath the old oak tree at the edge of her garden, marking the spot with a small stone and a handful of wildflowers. Word of Bramble's passing traveled slowly, as news often did in Halomere, carried from neighbor to neighbor, market stall to market stall. Eventually, it reached the ears of a traveling merchant who had once done business with the castle. He mentioned it in passing to a stable hand, who mentioned it to a guard, who eventually mentioned it to the king himself, now much older, his once dark hair turned fully gray, his shoulders bent slightly under the weight of decades of rule. The king sat quietly when he heard the news, saying nothing for a long while. His advisors assumed he was simply tired from the day's business. They did not know that, deep in his chest, an old ache had resurfaced, one he had carried quietly for years. He thought of the storm that had scattered the litter so long ago. He thought of his hound, who had paced restlessly at the edge of the forest for weeks afterward, searching for pups she would never find. He thought of the 2 times he had ridden to Halomere himself, watching from the shadows, never approaching, always telling himself there would be another chance. That chance, it seemed, had finally run out. But there was still Ayra, the woman who had found the pup, sheltered him, raised him, and loved him for years, without ever knowing the truth of where he had come from. The king realized that whatever debt he owed to that pup, he could still repay it to the woman who had raised him with such devotion. A few days later, a royal messenger arrived in Hallowmere, causing a great stir among the villagers. He made his way to Ayra's cottage and knocked gently on her door. When she opened it, surprised and a little nervous at the sight of a royal messenger, he informed her that the king himself wished to see her, and that he would be arriving shortly to speak with her personally. Ayra could hardly believe it. She had no idea why a king would wish to speak with a simple widow from a small village, and she spent the following hours anxiously tidying her cottage, unsure of what to expect. When the king arrived, he came without the usual grandeur of his court. He wore simple traveling clothes, much like the cloak he had worn on his quiet visits years before, and he asked to speak with Ayra alone. She welcomed him nervously into her small cottage, offering him a seat by the fire. The king looked around the modest room, his eyes settling for a long moment on the empty spot by the hearth where Bramble used to rest. Then he turned to Ayra and spoke gently. "I heard of the passing of your dog," he said. "I am told his name was Bramble." Ayra nodded, unsure why the king would know or care about such a small detail of her life. The king then told her the truth, the story of the storm, the scattered litter, and the connection between Bramble and his own beloved hound. He explained that he had ridden to her village twice over the years, simply to watch from afar, never finding the courage or the time to approach and reveal the truth. "I should have come sooner," he admitted quietly. "I should have thanked you sooner for the kindness you showed him, and for the love you gave him that I was too far away, and too caught up in my duties, to give myself." Ayra listened in stunned silence, tears gathering in her eyes as the pieces of Bramble's mysterious past finally came together. She thought of his noble bearing, his unusual intelligence, and the strange sense of dignity he had always carried, and suddenly, it all made a quiet kind of sense. "He was a wonderful companion," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "He gave me more comfort than I ever expected to find again after my husband passed. I did not need to know where he came from to love him, but I am glad to know now." The king nodded, a small, sad smile crossing his face. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for loving him so well." Before he left, the king offered to have a proper stone marker placed at Bramble's resting place beneath the old oak tree, a small tribute to the bond between his hound's lineage and the woman who had raised one of her sons with such devotion. Ayra gratefully accepted, and in the following weeks, a beautifully carved stone was placed beside her handmade one, bearing a simple engraving. "Here rests a loyal heart, loved always, watched from afar, and never forgotten." From that day on, Ayra often sat beneath the old oak tree, in the quiet hours of the evening, remembering the years she had spent with Bramble by her side. She no longer felt the sting of loneliness she once feared in her old age, for she carried with her the memory of a love that had crossed unseen distances, quietly wrapped around her humble little life for years, long before she ever knew it was there. And though the king returned to his castle and his duties, he too carried something new with him, a quiet peace, knowing that the pup he had watched from afar had spent his life surrounded by more love and devotion than any royal upbringing could have offered. In the end, it was not a crown or a bloodline that had given Bramble his remarkable life. It was the simple, steady love of a widow who had found a shivering, abandoned pup beneath her porch steps one stormy autumn morning, and had chosen, without hesitation, to love him as her own.